Hi, everyone. Lee Markum here, and I just want to go over some mistakes that I have seen over the years, mistakes that are going to cause some SQL Server problems, some SQL Server performance issues. And they're going to be in two broad categories, that being install or config mistakes that I see, and then also mistakes around poor database design. And so, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into some common install or configuration mistakes that I've seen over the years that are going to hurt your performance. The first thing is putting everything on the C drive. Now, I know that as data professionals, you know not to do this, but I still see it. And I think I see it because non-data professionals are often asked to install SQL Server and set it up. Maybe because there is no DBA at the shop and they don't know not to put everything on the C drive. Maybe they're in a rush and the development team needs it right now. And so they just click next, next, next through the installer, and voila, you have a SQL Server. Well, the problem with this is that you're contending with the operating system for I/O. You have different kinds of I/O within SQL Server for the data and the log files all happening on the C drive as well. They're going to be competing for space. So when you patch your system, you're going to be filling up the C drive. And if you fill up the C drive and everything is there, then this whole thing is going to crash. So this is a recipe for disaster that I'm hoping that someone will watch this and go check on their systems and make changes, or just avoid altogether by not putting everything on the C drive. The other thing that I see is just using all of the defaults. Now, the default installer for SQL Server has gotten a lot better over the years. And so some of these mistakes it helps you prevent. However, I've seen lots of environments out there, and I know that you don't all have modern SQL Server versions. So you have SQL Server 2000, 2005, all the old stuff is still out there in various places for various reasons. And so the defaults, if they were used for those, can be problematic. Things like your max server memory that wasn't set ever. Someone just clicked next, 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 and gave the developers a SQL Server and didn't bother to set this. Well, if that's the case, then SQL Server theoretically could hog all the memory on the system, and SQL Server and Windows are then in a tug of war over memory on the SQL Server. Another place where there are bad defaults is MaxStop. You really need to think about setting this to Microsoft's recommendations based on number of cores and NUMA that you have. And there is a KB article. If you search for KB MaxStop, you'll find the latest recommendations from Microsoft on what you should be setting that at. Another one is cost threshold for parallelism. This is another default that is problematic. The default right now is 5. Well, that's too low. That's going to control whether your query goes parallel. And in combination with MaxStop, it's going to control how many cores get used when it does go parallel. So 5 is an old standard from many, many years ago. And if you leave it there, then you're going to have a lot of low-cost queries that are going to go parallel, eating up your CPU, when if you would set that higher to something like 25 or even 50, then those low-cost queries won't be going parallel, and you'll have CPU available for larger queries that actually need that. Another install or config issue that I see is misconfiguration on tempdb. This alone could be an entire webinar or seminar, and I've watched and seen those. But the common things are that there aren't enough files, and that those files are not sized the same. Again, if you look up best practices for tempdb, you can see what you need to do in terms of the number of files and why sizing them the same matters. Number of files should be up to 8 as a maximum based on the number of CPUs or threads that you have available for operating the SQL Server. The file size matters between the different files that you would create for tempdb, because that affects the ability, the round robin ability of SQL Server to use the files as needed. If they're sized differently, then it doesn't round robin, and you can get contention because of that particular issue or problem. The second category where I see mistakes happen that cause performance problems is in this area of poor database design. The first thing I often see is tables just are not properly normalized. They're too wide. You have a customer table with 50 columns, and not all of those columns are directly related to customer data. You've mixed data domains into the same table. And so that can create problems because inside a single table, you have update, insert, and delete queries trying to take locks on various pieces of information in rows that, if it was normalized, wouldn't be all in the same table. And so you can have blocking and locking issues because your tables are not normalized like they should be. The other mistake that I see in terms of poor database design is just not having a clustering key or no primary key. This is a problem because without that clustering key, without the primary key, you don't have a way for SQL Server to look through logically ordered data. It's kind of like playing 52 card pickup. You throw a deck of cards in the air and they land on the ground, and then you tell someone, go find the ace of spades. And they literally start at some point and they work through all of the cards until they find the ace of spades. It's similar, but not quite that. That's an oversimplistic analogy, but it's similar. You're leaving SQL Server to only use the row IDs to be able to search to find data, and that is not an efficient way to find information. And it leads to performance problems in terms of increased I/O, increased CPU to do all of those kinds of RID lookups. The other thing is, or another thing, is poor data type selection, specifically around max data types. If you build tables and you just use the max data types because you're not sure how long a string can be, so you're just going to cover everything by saying max, that creates problems. The first problem that I can think of is that you can't have max columns in the key of an index. And so that makes your indexing strategy more difficult. If you select the proper data types other than max, you can also avoid large memory grants or grant requests. And if you have large memory grants, because you have this problem of too many max data types in your tables, you can actually have this poison weight type called resource semaphore. And what that is basically there's not enough RAM for your system to be able to allocate RAM to queries. And so they have to wait in order to get memory. Waiting queries is obviously not ideal. And so if you have 4, 5, 10, 50, 100 queries that are all needing a large amount of RAM, then some of them are going to have to wait. And those waiting queries are going to slow down your application. The last thing in terms of poor database design that I've seen is over-indexing. And I think that this is somewhat related to what I mentioned earlier about tables not being properly normalized. If you have a really wide table with lots of columns, then the tendency is you're going to have a lot of queries, a lot of different queries with a lot of different query patterns trying to access that data, either for select or insert, update, delete. And that's going to lead to a lot of missing index recommendations. And you should never just go and apply the missing index recommendations, but I've seen that too. And that can lead to this over-indexing scenario where you have 10, 15, 20, 100 non-clustered indexes on a single table. And that's going to slow down the system because every time SQL Server has to insert, update, or delete rows, records, columns that are contained in those 10, 20, 50, 100 indexes, it has to update the indexes also. And so that slows down the performance. So you really need to pay attention to over-indexing and take a look at your indexes, examine them with something like SPBlitz index, and consolidate duplicate or near duplicate indexes down so that you can take care of this problem of over-indexing your system. That's all I have for today in terms of mistakes that are causing performance problems for you. If this was interesting or you'd like some more information about SQL Server, you can hop on over to my website at leemarkum.com. Thank you. You have a great day.